on the brink of total war, with leadership that refuses to confront the real challenges facing the country, instead absorbing themselves with petty quarrels over symbolic issues. The people themselves lacking the horizons or foresight to see the impending disaster that their failed elites are taking them towards. While it certainly sounds a lot like 21st century Europe, I'm actually talking about the early 20th, and in particular, I am talking of Hungary. In this video, I'd like to take a look at this remarkable country in this critical era through Miklos Banffy's Transylvanian Trilogy, a trilogy of novels taking place in Hungary in the decade leading up to the First World War and culminating with the war's outbreak. Miklos Banffy was a Hungarian aristocrat, politician, and writer who served as a parliamentarian in Habsburg, Hungary, and then was a government minister in the early years of the new, much truncated post-war Hungarian state. He was a Transylvanian, that is, an ethnic Hungarian of Transylvania, a historical region of Hungary with a multi-ethnic and multi-religious history, and the historical redoubt of Hungarian nationalism. Today, Transylvania is a part of Romania. So, let's dive into this excellent novel, learn something together about Hungarian history, and maybe derive some political lessons for today. And for more content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. The main topics of my channel are history, literature, and politics, and this book has all of those things in spades. I came across a reference to this book, first of all, in a general history of Hungary that I was reading, and I'm so glad that I found it. The years just preceding the First World War were the last golden age of European civilization. From the First World War onwards, it's been a spiraling descent through decay and crises. This gives the preceding years, the Edwardian era to Englishmen or the Belle Epoque to the French, a very special place in our history, both as an example of Europe as a strong civilization, but also fascinating to study for the causes of the imminent catastrophe. And this applies to Hungary just as much, if not more so, than to most of our other countries in Europe, because they got a spectacularly bad deal out of the 20th century, losing proportionally more national territory than anyone else and being occupied by multiple neighbors. Miklos Banffy, the author, as a patriot and a politician who participated in post-war diplomacy, trying to lessen his country's misfortune, writing this book in 3 volumes between 1934 and 1940, was painfully aware of this national disaster and seeks to find some sense out of it through this novel. For the non-Hungarian reader who is also interested in how our civilization got thrown away, we can, in this book, get at the question from a whole new angle, from a part of Europe most of us know little about. Our story begins in 1904 in Transylvania, where our main protagonist is Balint Abadi. Abadi is clearly very close to our author. He is a Transylvanian aristocrat with liberal political leanings, with a strong paternalist interest in the well-being of the local peasantry, and a member of parliament who attempts to be a moderating influence on the fractious politics of his day. He is contrasted with a secondary protagonist in the form of his cousin Laszlo, a handsome and talented musician who is all too easily corrupted by nefarious social influences. We follow these two characters through their social lives in the Transylvanian elite, their love affairs, hunting trips, duels, political struggles in parliament, and their ultimate personal tragedies. For Laszlo, a descent into alcoholism and gambling addiction, and for Abadi, a dual crisis. A personal struggle for the woman he loves, and a political, and as we know, a failed struggle to prevent his country from being torn apart. It's a multifaceted book. One chapter will take us through the social intrigues of Hungarian aristocrats at balls, parties, and shooting events. The next will be all parliamentary politics. Then the next will have Abadi trudging through the Transylvanian mountains, trying to improve the lives of the local peasantry. In all respects, there is a sense of impending doom. No matter how hard Abadi works towards his goals, there is always a sense that he is swimming against the current, fighting for decency and moderation in politics, helping his fellow Transylvanians, and trying to save the woman he loves from her abusive husband. Abadi is an optimistic go-getter, living in a world that both the author and the reader knows is going to come crashing down. On the face of it, it may seem rather disjointed to relate so many disparate elements, but the author clearly believed social and romantic life could not be separated from politics. Abadi makes this explicit when he says the following: "All life is politics, and I don't just mean party politics. It is politics when I keep order on the estates and run the family properties. It's all politics. When we help the well-being of the people in the villages and the mountains, when we try to promote culture, it's still politics, I say, and you can't run away from it." Hungary at the time was part of the Habsburg dual monarchy, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Hungarian half of the monarchy was much larger than the modern state of Hungary and included vast territories populated by Slovaks, Croats, and Romanians, and it's the latter of whom who have the biggest presence in the novel, as they live in Transylvania. Hungarian politics of the time was dominated by two questions. First, what should be the relationship between Hungary and the rest of the Habsburg monarchy? And secondly, what should be the status of the non-Hungarian ethnic groups of Hungary? Thus, the key issue in Hungary was nationalism. Hungarian nationalism and its competition with Habsburg imperialism, and the nationalisms of the other races in Hungary. Now, far be it from me to downgrade the importance of the national question, but what we see in Hungary, as depicted in this novel, is the inability of the political class to deal effectively with any other issue. For example, from the second half of the 19th century, the Habsburg Empire starts to fall behind in military preparedness. Yet they are unable to modernize the military because of disagreements between the Austrian and Hungarian governments over symbolic issues like the language of command in Hungarian regiments and the color of officers' lapels. This political obstruction notoriously leaves the Habsburg military unprepared for the war it chooses to fight in 1914. But besides this, it does nothing to resolve the other nationality question, the status of the minority nationalities who are seeking to assert themselves. None of these things, taken alone, explain the catastrophe that was coming to Hungary, but they certainly help to make the catastrophe more likely and to make it worse when it did come. Unable to achieve success in practical issues of governance, Hungarian politicians instead focus on outdoing each other in nationalist speeches, play acting as the good patriot, denouncing their opponents for betraying the Hungarian nation to the Habsburgs or to the minorities. Yet whenever they themselves get into government, they often find they must compromise, ever so slightly, with the reality of Hungarian constitutional and demographic circumstances. And so the roles become reversed. Now they are the traitors and their opponents are the good patriots. They do all this with the attitude that no one outside of Hungary pays them any attention. And I quote from the novel: "It was nothing more than the almost universal belief of Hungarian politicians that their voices could only be heard inside their own country. Their whole conception of politics was based on this, and nobody for a moment believed that their actions and words were watched or heard by anyone abroad, not even Apponyi, whose brother-in-law was ambassador in London, and who presumably wrote home from time to time, nor Andrassy, whose father was close to Franz Joseph's intimate circle, and who had for a while been a diplomat himself. In the heat of domestic passions, it had never occurred to them to think of such matters as anything but the skirmishes of party politics, which no one outside Hungary could for a moment understand or even be interested in. To these men, the horizon extended no further than Vienna, and outside this circle, this little Hungarian globe, there was nothing." Moving to the social lives of the Hungarian aristocracy as seen in the novel, a major theme that comes up again and again is wasted potential. Just as the politicians waste their energies on insignificant matters while serious events are taking place in the world around them, so too the Hungarian elite as a whole, when not arguing politics, is no longer living up to the standards our hero expects of a ruling class. For most of the aristocrats in the novel, according to their various tastes, all that matters are balls, gambling, drinking bouts, shooting, and breeding horses. Abadi's friend Laszlo, for example, despite being a promising music student in Budapest, wastes his time and energy organizing dances. He then becomes addicted to gambling, which itself ruins his prospects for marriage, and subsequently lives only for drink. In living thus, he rejects the all life is politics philosophy of Abadi and fails to perform the correct function of an aristocrat. Another character in the novel starts out as being known as good for nothing but horses and shooting parties, which is not necessarily a negative in these circles. But this character later has doubts about decisions in his life. He realizes that actually there is a world of philosophy, of education, and culture that he has missed out on. He becomes convinced that he has wasted his life on horses, starts to read foreign literature in an attempt to catch up and improve himself, but tragically comes to believe that his chance is already gone, and so, tragically, unfortunately, commits suicide. In his will, he leaves money to his nephews on condition that they get themselves a university education outside of Hungary, outside of that little globe. There are more examples like this throughout the novel that add up to a picture of a ruling class that is no longer able to justify its position and privileges. While all this was going on, while the Hungarian elite is embarrassing itself both in parliament and at the gambling table, events in the world around Hungary are moving forward. Europe is becoming more tense. Austria is competing with Russia in the Balkans, the Germans with Britain at sea. The Balkan states themselves go to war with the Ottomans. All the time, we sense that the world is becoming a less stable and more threatening place. Yet the Hungarian political nation fails to comprehend and fails to respond to the changing circumstances. A tragic figure of the novel, who will be familiar to students of the origins of the First World War, is István Tisza, the sometime minister-president of Hungary. It's obvious that Miklos Banffy greatly respected this man. He's the only Hungarian political figure who is depicted with great dignity throughout the novel. An intelligent man, a patriot who loves his country sincerely but understands the danger facing it, and by trying to avert those dangers is often branded a traitor by his political enemies. In 1914, heir to the Habsburg throne, Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo by Serb terrorists. A month later, Austria would go to war with Serbia, thus beginning the First World War. We know that during the interval between the assassination and the outbreak of the war, István Tisza was a moderating force within the internal debate in Austria-Hungary about whether to go to war or not. He did not favor war, but he ultimately felt obliged to give his consent to the conflict. The population of Budapest and the characters of the novel are unaware of these niceties. All they know is Tisza is sending Hungary to war, and they are enthusiastic to give the Serbs a good kicking. The Budapest mob want Tisza to come out on the balcony of Parliament and give them a speech to rouse their passions further for the war. But he refuses to come to the balcony and speak, much to everyone's consternation. Everyone is getting frustrated with him. The mob outside is angry. His political allies are angry, his fellow parliamentarians. And he won't do it because Tisza senses the scale of the cataclysm coming to his country. Our protagonist, the baddie, sees him. He never forgot the moment when he had seen him there, sitting in silence in the deep armchair with his legs crossed, his thick-lensed glasses making his eyes seem so much larger, a bitter crease on his forehead, and even more bitter lines reaching down each side of his face. He had sat there motionless, staring ahead of him as if all he could see was the fate of his country, silent, chewing a cigar. I highly recommend this book to anyone interested in pre-First World War history, politics, and culture, and anyone with a particular interest in Central Europe. Most likely, if you are a native English speaker, this is a region of Europe that has a bit part in history, is a secondary character in someone else's history, if you like. We often learn bits of Hungarian history via Austrian history, Habsburg history, Ottoman history, or Soviet history. It's been fascinating for me putting Hungary center stage, both in history books and in this novel. And I would definitely be interested to read more Hungarian literature after this. It's been fascinating and informative. You get universal, applicable truths from particular circumstances because there are constants in the human condition. So you'll find surprisingly relevant historical and cultural lessons in unexpected places. And I think in this case, we have a very knowledgeable and a very experienced host in the form of Miklos Banffy, author, patriot, parliamentarian, politician, who had invited us into his world, and in the process sheds light on issues that should be important to all of us. Just before I enumerate what insights I think are available in the novel, I want to say quickly that I found the novel aesthetically very pleasing. There's an awful lot of characters in this long book, but like our Dickens, he's able for the most part to make them distinct and memorable enough that it doesn't become a chore remembering who everyone is. The strength in this case of having such a large roster of characters is that the author can introduce more of Hungary and Hungarian personalities to us, which as a non-Hungarian is part of the appeal of the book. Also, it's a very musical novel. You always know what music the characters are listening to, from gypsy drinking music to the Radetzky March, an aspect I really enjoyed, and I've even used some music from the novel in this video. I've talked a lot of the politics in the novel, but it also shows a great deal of love in the author for the landscape of his Transylvanian homeland, and for the architecture of the places he grew up in, which is described in detail. It's also a great and tragic romance novel. So there's an awful lot going on in this book, which is why it's big. Originally in 3 volumes, I read a 2-volume edition from Everyman's Library, totaling about 1,400 pages. Didn't get boring at any point for me. Now let's finish off with some of my personal takeaways from the novel. As I'm sure was clear from the aforementioned discussion, we are presented here with a ruling class in decline. Not a demographic or material decline, but a moral decline. They are increasingly unable to justify their existence and power, and have lost their knack for producing competent leadership figures. Obviously, there's a lot of retrospective explaining going on here, as there is with similar British novels that seek to find an explanation for the disaster of the First World War in the decline of the ruling class pre-war. Sometimes that kind of writing can be quite unjust, but I think Miklos Banffy is reasonable in his depiction of a ruling class increasingly preoccupied with petty squabbles and unable to believe that anything really bad could actually happen to them. I believe we see a similar complacency in the West today, certainly in my country at any rate. One way that this is manifest that particularly struck me was the way in the novel Hungarian politicians believed that only other Hungarians paid attention to their rhetoric, when in reality they are noticed by the world at large and thus do great harm to the empire. Just consider today, many a British or American politician would think nothing of domestically denouncing his country's supposed history of oppression or imperialism or what have you, and then go on the world stage and lecture others on human rights or the rules-based order, not realizing that they have thrown away any moral authority trying to win petty domestic political arguments. Shocked they are to find politicians in Asia or Africa know only too well how to talk the language of American revisionism. Our current leaders haven't gotten us all killed in the trenches of Flanders or Galicia, at least not yet. But Miklos Banffy, if he had any broad political lesson to share with us from his vast experience, it's that this kind of hubris, complacency, ignorance even, on the part of the ruling elite can get very dangerous very suddenly. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed a video like this, where literature and politics meet together, then you may well enjoy my video on Aristophanes' play Parliament of Women, a classical Greek comedy on political deadlock, revolution, and free love. Thank you very much.